research using an interdisciplinary stance. Let me hit that I got it and go back to the slideshow. So I'm coming from an interdisciplinary position. I don't know if it's, there we go. I'm blending anthropological approaches of ethnography with expertise as a clinical psychologist and volunteer clinical practice at Bhutan's main hospital, the Jigme Dorji Wangchuk National Referral Hospital. And so I refer to my approach as embedded clinical ethnography. And from this engaged position, I've been able to observe hundreds of clinical cases from different regions of Bhutan, observing which interventions led to improvement and which seemed less effective. And I've been able to hang out in the community and familiarize myself with the local ways of life, as well as hanging out with my Bhutanese clinical coworkers and with patients. This interdisciplinary stance has altered the usual ethical priorities of anthropological fieldwork, which I see as having become narrowly focused on an ethics of intercultural understanding and acceptance, often with an extreme relativist suspension of any judgment or evaluation. Within this ethic, the local status quo is often assumed to be ideal, and any external forms of intervention are likely to be critiqued as imperialist, neo-colonialist, etc. My clinical involvement, however, demonstrates that there are other more consequentialist ethical priorities, such as health outcomes, diagnostic clarity, and effective treatment choices, and these call for empirically defensible theoretical stances rather than simply fashionable stances that assume they occupy the highest moral position by defending extreme relativism, localism, and decolonialism. So the theoretical stances I find somewhat problematic include Foucaultian, constructivist, and decolonial critiques, which assume that anything theorized in the West, for example, the concept of a mental disorder, because it may have a historical origin in the West, is thus simply a local aspect of Western culture with no relevance to people in any other society, and with the exporting of these ideas understood as necessarily an aspect of neo-colonialism. This view would seem to preclude any discovery of scientific or medical facts that accurately reflect our status as a single human species. And this fashionable theoretical stance comes with certain automatic reactions. For example, if I tell you that I observed and treated many young Bhutanese people who were experiencing education-related stress, the decolonialist argument might immediately assume that the problem is due to Western-style education, coming in with the aim of preparing students for unequal positions in a global economy. However, the reality is that I also worked with monks in training, more than one, who couldn't deal with the stresses of that indigenous path of training for an indigenous role. The training of monks in Bhutan involves extremely long days packed full of activities and demands, not even mentioning the 3 years spent in isolated meditation retreat, which are sometimes too much for the young student's psyche. So we see how the automatic assumptions of the standard Foucaultian/decolonial critique may fall apart. Both Western and indigenous education systems can generate stress that, when coming into contact with individual differences in resilience, may produce the outcomes I have observed among students: suicidal depressive states, dissociative symptoms, out of control behaviors, self-harm, and other typical reactions. These automatic assumptions arise, as I said, from fashionable theoretical stances that offer a one-size-fits-all explanation. They are adopted because they sound good. They sound like they should be ethical. Within anthropology, an increasingly prominent strain of this thinking has manifested as the ontological turn, which treats different local contexts as separate universes. A.I. Hallowell popularized anthropological studies of indigenous ontology several decades ago, but he studied ontology in what I see as a defensible manner, as an aspect of local psychology, a worldview bound up with cognitive orientations shaped by culture that influences psychological experience. The new ontological anthropology, which includes a focus on themes central to Hallowell's work, especially other than human persons and local metaphysics of being, seems to me a largely uncredited restatement of Hallowell, minus the psychological level of analysis, and perhaps also minus the cultural level of analysis, since different societies are treated as inhabiting different universes, not different experiential universes, but different physical universes. And this reinforces an extreme social constructionist relativism, elevating cultural worldviews to the status of literal reportage of independent physical universes, the literal reality of which we can't question, lest we be called unethical, ethnocentric imperialists. This stance reinforces, however, an othering Orientalism that denies a common level of humanity that we all share. And I also see much of the decolonializing agenda making these problematic assumptions. This seminar series was framed in terms of decolonizing Himalayan studies. If the meaning here is that Himalayan studies should move beyond the exoticism to study actual human lives in context, then I fully agree. However, if the assumption is that all external cultural influences are necessarily imperialistic or neo-colonial, or otherwise victimizing or harmful, then based on the findings that I'll discuss, I disagree. At the very least, we should judge each cultural influence on a case-by-case basis, avoiding blanket interpretations of all cultural change as colonial, especially because Himalayan peoples have agency, and they can and do choose to incorporate the cultural influences that they want to incorporate. In fact, the blanket attitude that wants to prevent any culture change, to keep Himalayan people frozen as exhibits in a natural history museum, to make Western scholars feel good about themselves, that's the viewpoint I find really exoticizing, othering, and neo-colonial. In the domain of healthcare, this blanket decolonial stance against non-Indigenous healthcare options becomes unethical when the local alternatives do not adequately treat the often life-threatening disorders and illnesses we encounter. And this stance is also less relevant for a country like Bhutan, which wasn't colonized and which welcomes the best of Western medical care. Bhutan has provided an interesting natural experiment in relation to the perennial charges that mental disorders are simply inventions of the West that have been exported unnecessarily. Note here that I'm talking about the patterns of disorder themselves, not just the labels we give the disordered patterns. The labels are obviously abstract descriptions we've constructed, though informed by scientific findings. Beyond that are the actual biopsychological and behavioral states. And that's what I mean when I refer to a mental disorder or illness. The confusion of labels with realities to which they refer is a hallmark of postmodernism, and it's a logical fallacy called the use-mention error. What interested me about Bhutan was that it has not been indoctrinated into the so-called Western psychiatric ideology. The mental health system was founded only in the late 90s, and it's still not the dominant approach to the understanding and treatment of mental disorders in the country. Spiritual understandings and rituals are still the dominant modality of understanding and intervening. And as I said, Bhutan was never colonized. It's remained relatively isolated from the West throughout its history. So as a practicing clinician dealing with a lot of local patients, would I see radically different patterns of mental illness, or the same patterns to which I've become accustomed elsewhere, or no mental illness because Bhutan is a happy Buddhist Shangri-La? No mental illness would certainly support the cultural determinist, localist, and relativist arguments. And I'm certainly open to being convinced that a relativist argument is appropriate in a specific case. After all, I published a book arguing that the Native American peyote ceremony is not simply believed to be effective, but is a sophisticated set of interventions within a radically different paradigm that actually is effective. So these were open questions for me. Are the illness presentations very different? Will Bhutanese patients respond to the standard psychological and psychiatric treatments as expected? Or are the standard approaches completely irrelevant? And what are the effects of healing rituals and the traditional medical system, Soa Rigpa? Are there healing practices already in place that may be useful? Let's enter the realities of my ethnographic experience in Bhutan through a single revelatory moment from my field notes. I'm in morning ward rounds at the country's main hospital in Thimphu, during which we as the clinical team review patients and the progress of ongoing treatment, meeting 3 times per week. I'm looking at a tall and rugged Bhutanese woman. Her face is weathered and expressionless. She has a stoic, resigned set to her jaw. As she speaks to my colleague and host, the Bhutanese chief psychiatrist, Dr. Sencho, about her recent psychiatric relapse, a single tear rolls down her cheek. She's from a rural area where she's the second wife in a plural marriage. She had suffered from a severe and chronic psychotic disorder, but responded well to monthly depot injections of an antipsychotic medication and was stable for a long period. But then the supply of the medicine from India was interrupted. The medicine became unavailable and she had a traumatic and destabilizing relapse. Dr. Sencho gazes at her. She is charging me, he explains, because we didn't have her medication. I ask myself, what sort of anthropological perspectives should we bring to such clinical encounters dealing with painful human emotions and vulnerabilities? Critical studies of the domination of Western pharmaceuticals? Or critiques of the power differences between powerful clinicians and victimized patients? Or relativist arguments that modern psychiatry is simply the local ethnopsychology of Western Europeans and Americans? These standard critical approaches to analysis all fall flat in the face of the real human suffering experienced by people with mental disorders and their search for appropriate treatments, their search for stability and better life chances. So what sort of ethnographic approach do I think we should use to study such painful human realities? This has been a central question in my work, and I'll discuss the ways in which incorporating clinical practice into fieldwork has altered the way I answer this question. First, I now strongly feel that critiques of clinical practices and understandings shouldn't be ignorant of them, nor of the experience of the local treatment teams or the challenges of severe mental disorders. So I've embedded myself as a full-time member of locally run clinical teams, which allows me to become familiar with their understandings, as well as with the understandings and experiences of a large number of patients and their families. This allows for detailed observation of illness patterns, local therapeutic intervention and outcomes, patients' understandings of illness, therapeutic narratives, and the use of rituals and plant medicines. This engaged perspective, balanced between anthropology and clinical psychology, has reoriented my ethical and theoretical priorities, which has fed into my teaching. With my students, who are often under the sway of the new ontological anthropology or another repackaging of one-sided relativism, I use the word meta-relativism to indicate a relativized relativism, an approach that's open to finding surprising cultural differences, but that's equally open to finding and acknowledging universal aspects of human experience, even in an exoticized place like Bhutan. Another term I use trying to get at the same idea is scalable localism. In my opinion, the cure to facile relativism is actually more relativism. And this position is very much in the spirit of relativism. So a relative relativism, remaining open to pan-human realities at a level of abstraction, is actually a truer relativism than a rigid absolutist relativism, which is actually self-refuting. How can one be a rigid absolutist relativist? If you say everything is relative, then so is that statement. So the statement itself is self-refuting. This suggests an interdisciplinary stance, which is especially crucial for understanding complex human realities of illness and treatment, and which is the ethical stance when lives are on the line. Intellectually, getting beyond the theoretical dichotomy between anthropological relativism and the psychological mapping and evaluation of locally observable clinical realities is exciting because it forces us to evaluate on a case-by-case basis. It forces us to do careful clinical ethnography in local contexts to figure out which aspects are relative or locally shaped and which simply reflect our common humanity and the disorders to which we are all prone. Finally, I actively seek a dialectical understanding in fieldwork through an approach I describe as dialectical challenge. I challenge anthropological perspectives with clinical psychological perspectives and vice versa. I also challenge ethnographic experiences with contrasting ethnographic experiences. For example, in my earlier field research in relation to my evolving relativist view of Native American use of the psychoactive peyote cactus, I deliberately sought immersion in contexts which could challenge and possibly disconfirm a relativist view of psychoactive substance use. The dialectical challenge involved undergoing years of training in diagnosis and treatment of substance abuse disorders and incorporating clinical practice with Native Americans and other patients having very real problems with addiction and harmful abuse. I think of this pattern of dialectical challenge, experiencing Native American substance abuse cases at the same time as studying peyote use, as doing counter-ethnography, generating not only counter-arguments, but counter-experiences. And this dialectical discovery-oriented stance directly opposes what I see as the repackaged anti-psychological relativism of the new ontological anthropology, which seems always to work towards a predetermined ideologically driven answer. Thus, I chose Bhutan as another opportunity for dialectical challenge through counter-ethnography. Let's zoom out to introduce the field site a bit. So Bhutan is a Vajrayana Buddhist kingdom in the eastern Himalayas, wedged between China and India, with an officially recognized population of around 750,000 people. Given its location across several high mountain valleys and other factors, Bhutan has remained very isolated for most of its history. It allowed television and the internet only in 1999. Much of the country is rural, dotted with small villages and towns like Wangdi here. Bhutan was and still is ruled from massive fortresses called dzongs, which house government offices as well as the local monk body. The dzongs are also sites of the religious festivals called sechus. A common marriage pattern in Bhutan is for a man to marry several sisters. And this photo shows the previous king with his 4 queens, all sisters. Bhutanese religion has been very strongly influenced by Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism. Vajrayana Buddhism is characterized by frightening guardians and local deities who are considered to have been converted to Buddhism. Though the country is strongly Buddhist, most Bhutanese see the landscape as populated by many invisible entities. including deities and spirits with whom positive relations must be maintained to avoid illness and misfortune. Accumulation of merit is an important activity, which includes not only compassionate acts, but also a sort of mechanical generation of merit through circling shrines, as people are doing here around the National Memorial Chorten. There's a funny story of a dog chasing a pig around and around the shrine, with both achieving enlightenment because of the merit earned. Merit is also accumulated by spinning prayer wheels like this one. This photo was taken at a high school that my wife Tracy was observing. Central cultural concepts in Bhutan include compassion, karma, and the concept of Tunlam, which my colleague Ulrika Chokel has studied extensively, and she'll be speaking on the 13th. Tunlam always brings to mind the popular story of the four harmonious friends, four animals who cooperated to nurture a tree and were then able to enjoy the fruits. So far, I've spent an initial 4 summers doing field research in Bhutan, spending most of my time in the capital city, Thimphu. Bhutan is undergoing a high level of rural to urban migration, which is changing patterns of work, gender roles, and patterns of illness. The capital city is experiencing many new problems, such as disruptive youth and significant substance abuse problems. Actually, alcoholism is the #1 cause of deaths at the hospital where I volunteer. Alcoholic drinks have long been central to Bhutanese social relations, but the amounts produced were limited. However, today, trucks full of cheap liquor are imported from India in seemingly unlimited quantities. So here again, we see in exoticized Bhutan problems all too familiar elsewhere. This is one of the main streets in the city center, and stray dogs are everywhere, sleeping in the middle of the street, not having to fear because in this Buddhist country, everyone takes great pains to avoid hurting them. The nearby Clock Tower Square is a common meeting place. When I go to Bhutan, I work closely with the country's chief psychiatrist, treating psychiatric patients and training clinical staff at the country's main hospital. I work primarily with adult patients having episodes of severe mental illness. The health system in Bhutan is slowly modernizing, owing much to support from India. Medical treatment is provided free by the government. There were only 2 permanent psychiatrists and a few psychiatric nurses for the entire country. Not much clinical psychology and very little psychotherapy of any kind. The system relied heavily on medication with some psychoeducation for detoxing drug and alcohol patients. While I was there, we also started an anxiety group. The mental health system was launched only in 1997 with the opening of the psychiatry unit at the Jigme Dorji Wangchuk National Referral Hospital. An inpatient psychiatry ward was opened later in April 2004. I started working in Bhutan in 2011, 7 years after the inpatient ward was opened. Patients at the hospital are taken in with a family member who cares for them and manages their behavior. The inpatient ward is not usually locked, and there's no security. However, extremely violent patients could have the door on their room locked if they were a danger to other patients. Patients on the inpatient ward meet with staff 3 times per week during ward rounds. These meetings focus on the patient's status, response to treatment, and readiness for discharge, or referral to rehab in the case of substance abusers. Clinical staff would also do treatment planning. While I was there, the meetings would allow me to identify good candidates for psychotherapy, education, or skills training. With the launching of the mental health system, Bhutan introduced modern mental health practices into communities that until then had relied solely on traditional forms of treatment, mainly rituals led by shamans and to a lesser extent, traditional medicines or appeal to astrologers or Buddhist monks. By far the most typical approach to mental disorders are the shamanic interventions. The 5-hour-long ritual shown in this photo was for a hospital colleague's lower back pain, which he interpreted as due to the loss of a component of his soul. The aim of such rituals is to negotiate with the attacking spirit, make offerings of food to it, and convince it to release its hold on the victim. The altar is lined with tormas, ritual cakes made from dough or butter, usually in a conical shape, used as offerings. A recent major ritual led by the country's spiritual leader offered coronavirus-shaped tormas to the powerful protector deity to be devoured. Hours of shamanistic performance in trance culminate in the location of a spider, an animal that captures its prey, which is placed on the head of the patient to signify that the life force has been returned from its captor. In addition to soul loss, some illness is attributed to witchcraft or black magic. I was told that evil eye was considered prevalent in Bhutan, and that's why children's pet names are often insulting, for example, translating as dumb, to ward off the envy of others. Some entire families in Bhutan are labeled poison givers, and people are told not to take any food from them. The king himself tried to dispel the stigma that results from this belief by accepting ada, a local homemade alcoholic beverage, from those ostracized as poison givers. This demonstrates not a frozen alternative universe, but instead a country interested in making progress in the treatment of its most vulnerable people. We encountered many patients in the psychiatric ward who mentioned thinking that they were the victims of black magic. There's also a widespread attribution of illness to spirit possession. The other treatment options available don't really offer viable alternatives for severe mental illness. The traditional medical system, Soa Rigpa, will likely diagnose a problem with the wind humor, lung, and they do associate some herbal preparations with mental problems. I identified 7. I did a quick analysis of the ingredients of these preparations, which revealed that 6 contain Mystrica fragrans, a weak monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and 5 contain Aquilaria goloca, a CNS depressant. So these medicines are probably mildly psychoactive, but not really suitable for treating the full range of severe mental disorders. I was curious about what Buddhism experts in Bhutan think about mental disorders, so I visited this monastery brought by a clinical coworker who knows the head monk. It was a remarkably prototypical experience of climbing up a mountain to visit a Himalayan monastery to ask a question. When we got to the top, after a short communal meditation, I had the opportunity to ask the head monk how they viewed mental illness. His reply was, really, you guys down there at the hospital are the experts. And in fact, we have a monk up here who's been acting strangely, and we wonder if you could have a chat with him. Not only was this somewhat anticlimactic in relation to the romantic Himalayan stereotype, but they also put me to work in evaluation. The take-home point is that they didn't claim to have a definitive treatment for severe mental illness. Okay. Some findings and cases. My findings after 4 summers of fieldwork and clinical practice is we definitely see the same sorts of psychiatric illnesses in Bhutan that we find around the world, though they tend to be locally interpreted as spiritual afflictions. Mental illness is most often explained in terms of spirit possession soul loss, or magic, or being punished by a deity, or ultimately as due to karma, the effect of something one did in a previous existence. However, even given the local interpretations, I saw lots of classic presentations of familiar disorders. Even though most of the population have not adopted modern psychiatric interpretive frameworks, clinical ethnography in Bhutan reveals the classic symptoms of psychotic disorders, mood disorders, mania, panic attacks, epilepsy, alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicide found throughout the country. During my second summer of fieldwork, I treated a young man from a relatively isolated area of Western Bhutan. He initially complained of distressing thoughts, causing pain inside his body, making him weak. He was a student and couldn't study. After a while talking with him, I discovered that he ruminates if he has negative thoughts about another person. When he sees friends smoking, chewing doma or betel, or acting negatively in some other way, he has negative thoughts about them. He obsessed about these negative thoughts and felt he had to neutralize them. So when he had the thought, that's a negative person not acting true to their cultural values, he tried to neutralize this thought by pairing this person with a positive person in his mind. And he often ordered a group of people in his mind as follows: bad person, good person, bad person, good person, so that each bad person was paired with a good person to neutralize the badness. Our abstract description of this phenomenon is obsessive compulsive disorder with a mental ritual, a type of anxiety disorder. His behavior of neutralizing negative thoughts we describe as a compulsive ritual. I treated a case very similar to this one during my time working at a Harvard teaching hospital. So this case shows classic OCD symptoms in a relatively isolated population within Bhutan without a lot of knowledge of modern psychiatry, which shows that this pattern of mental disorder is not entirely a construct of the West. It's something much more general to the human condition that receives a local interpretation or label. We saw a good amount of dissociative disorders and conversion disorders. The dissociative states were usually interpreted in terms of spirit possession. And we successfully treated many cases that were interpreted as spiritual in origin using modern psychological and psychiatric methods. I'll describe a case that was initially interpreted in spiritual terms and was treated with rituals unsuccessfully for weeks before the patient was finally brought to the psychiatry ward. This was a lady in her mid-30s who runs a hotel in central Bhutan. And she had worked very hard during a 3-day conference at the hotel and became sick. Her family stated she hadn't slept in 8 days. She didn't want to stay in the house and kept leaving to go for walks. More troubling was she began speaking in someone else's voice, saying she had been mistreated. She was identifying details of a girl who died who worked at another hotel. So the pattern the family saw was that of possession by a shindi, a dead spirit. She became aggressive with her husband and mother, and the family stated 2 men couldn't hold her. The voice said, "Till now I have been working hard. Nobody knew what I was going through. Now I will make you work." Ritual treatments were tried, but none helped. As a last resort, she was brought to the hospital. I interpreted this case in terms of what I've learned not only from clinical psychology, but what I've learned about spirit possession in other places, such as Africa. The classic anthropological theory in this area is that it seems that it's the people who are under stress and who feel a lack of power who become possessed by a spirit. Their own voice might not be taken seriously or heard by the people around them, so their mind creates another voice that the society has to take very seriously. It's all done unconsciously. It's a dissociative state. So it seemed likely to me that as in studies of the Tsar cult by people like I.M. Lewis and Janice Bodie, our Shindy case was a destabilized woman's dissociated cry for help in a voice that her community would take notice of, the voice of an invading spirit. This woman's treatment at the hospital involved encouraging her family to be patient and support her, along with plenty of rest and some medicines to help her relax. This eventually brought her out of the episode and back to her original personality. Note that in this case, I applied cross-cultural anthropological findings to better understand a clinical case in terms of culturally shaped dissociative symptoms. And this modern clinical perspective worked better than the rituals. So we generally saw the same sorts of mental disorders encountered in many other places. And patients generally responded to treatment as expected, which is not perfect, even when the illness seemed very spiritual to them. However, depending on the patient, there might not be a real awareness that it was a psychological treatment that helped. The spiritual understanding of illness is very persistent in Bhutan, even when modern treatment has effectively treated the problem. For example, we had a case of a young man with catatonia being brought into the ward by his father. The young man's body was very stiff. He was unresponsive, only able to speak in a whisper. His father was very loving and was trying everything he could, but he interpreted his son's condition in religious terms. He thought the illness was caused by the spirit of a dead person, a Shindy. So he kept seeking pujas, healing rituals, to cure his son. He was a southern Bhutanese, so he began with Hindu pujas, and then he added Buddhist pujas. And when these didn't work, he became Christian and tried a church. And when all else had failed, he brought his son to the hospital. But he still had trouble accepting that his son's condition was due to a long untreated mental disorder. His son was put on psychiatric medication, which lifted the catatonia in a few weeks. Several weeks later, I saw the father and son when they came in for a follow-up appointment. The son was looking much better. He was able to smile and talk and wasn't stiff anymore from the catatonia. So the medications were working. However, the father pulled me aside and asked me if his mixing of different religious traditions had been what was prolonging the illness. Even though I tried to explain, he couldn't understand or accept that the problem was due to the long untreated mental disorder and that the psychiatric medicines were what helped his son. And a year later, the son was back in the ward catatonic again. This persistent tendency to view mental illness in spiritual rather than psychiatric terms led many in Bhutan's psychiatric department to feel we treat the patient and solve the problem, but the improvement is then attributed to that last ritual finally kicking in. Even in a peaceful Buddhist society like Bhutan, psychotic homicides also take place. I completed an evaluation on one such case, a man who stabbed his wife to death in response to command auditory hallucinations. And I heard about other such situations. We had another man, young man on the inpatient ward who was nonstop violent, ripping to shreds anything he got his hands on in the ward after doing the same at home. We had to put him in one of the rooms on the ward that was able to be padlocked, and he proceeded to try tearing the walls apart. Dr. Sencho tried to open the door a bit to talk with him, and he grabbed and destroyed Sencho's eyeglasses. And I can't remember how we finally got him medicated, but eventually he was able to calm down. Among the most anxiety-provoking patients to me were those near death from alcohol abuse. Alcoholism problems are very severe. As I said, the #1 cause of death in the hospital. And a lot of the patients were detoxing from alcohol or other substances. standard practice was to use diazepam to help them detox. We got several patients who had psychotic symptoms due to their withdrawal from alcohol. I really wanted to get out a public health message about the dangers of trying to detox on your own, as well as another danger I noted, the abuse of an over-the-counter painkiller called spasmoproxavan. Spasmoproxavan, or SP, is among the most abused substances in Bhutan, which is very unfortunate because the pill bundles together a deadly combination of the opioid tramadol with paracetamol. So you become addicted to the opioid in the pill, taking more and more, and then the paracetamol, which is a deadly liver poison, starts destroying your liver. So I saw a lot of very young Bhutanese with wrecked livers. I consulted people in the community about how to get out effective public health messages, and I was told that adding dramatic performance and music will effectively draw attention to the messages. So I used some of my British Academy funding to hire a group of actors and musicians. We collaborated on a script dramatizing these risky situations, and we put on an educational street theater in the main vegetable market in Thimphu. We also gave some messaging about first aid for those with epilepsy. As nurses in the inpatient unit verified to me, epilepsy is widely considered in Bhutan to be contagious, so people often block others from helping someone who's had a seizure. I played the role of Dr. Joe and tried to slip in some medical education in between the songs and performances. Hospital staff did a lot of work trying to explain to patients the significance of their dangerous liver test results. In an attempt at culturally consonant confrontational treatment, the chief psychiatrist would often send patients with life-endangering alcoholism on darshan to see their maha gurus, patients in the medical units dying from cirrhosis, before they depart this world. Darshan is a Sanskrit word that basically means going to view a deity or a great teacher to receive a blessing. Changse guru is another term used locally for one accomplished in alcohol. Preventing deaths from alcohol use is challenging because sharing alcoholic beverages is at the heart of Bhutanese sociality and its gestures of hospitality. It's also at the center of Bhutanese rituals. The problem is also exacerbated by rapid urbanization and social change. Many people run bars to generate income, and there are several hundred in Thimphu when I was there. I'll always remember one young man who I worked with for several months, including meeting outside of the hospital with his friends who were trying to support him after his discharge. His liver was in really bad shape. As I was on my way to the airport on the last day of a Bhutan visit, I encountered him during a large festival, completely drunk in the middle of the day. He tried to get in my taxi with me, but I had to tell him I was on my way to the airport. There were many other severe cases like this that ended in death. There was a mutual support organization for addicts named Chituan Pendi that was launched during my fieldwork, and I gave them several trainings. I also found myself providing a lot of family and couples therapy for very familiar problems associated with urban living and nuclear families. These include family arguments, absent partners, women feeling stuck at home, domestic violence, jealousy, out of control adolescence, all exacerbated by alcohol abuse. I was able to use training in mutual reflective listening and negotiation approaches with some success. So my basic conclusion after treating many Bhutanese patients is that the evidence doesn't support a strong relativist or decolonial argument on forms of mental disorder and their treatment. What stands out, given Bhutan's long isolation and lack of colonial history, is an argument for species-wide patterns of mental disorder that coexist with a relatively independent stream of spiritual interpretations and responses. In opposition to the new ontological anthropology and the blanket decolonial agenda, and in line with a more clinically informed ethics and observation of clinical outcomes, I argue that it's not good enough to simply agree with the most traditional local understandings and attack all deviations as ethnocentric and imperialist. And this is also the opinion of many of my Bhutanese colleagues. Decolonial authors often ignore the diversity of opinion within a society, prioritizing the most traditionalist people and downplaying people who find something from Western culture or medicine useful. In fact, the story of my colleague, Dr. Tsencho, with whom I co-authored an article in the Journal of Bhutan Studies, is very instructive. Growing up, Tsencho witnessed his older brother becoming psychotic. His brother was initially very gifted and entered training for the monkhood at 13. However, he was later sent home from his training. He began showing out of control behavior, including charging at his younger brothers with a knife. Seeking to protect their family but still care for the eldest brother, Tsencho's parents locked the brother in a storage room on the second floor of their large farmhouse. His meals were slid through a hole in the door, and an opening was cut in the floor through which he could defecate. His brother lived this way for over 10 years. This is a common local response to mental disorders by Bhutanese families who have a dangerously out of control relative who they don't know how to manage. They may also chain them. This will at least hopefully keep them from harming themselves or others, or prevent them from wandering into the jungle and starving to death. However, with modern treatment, many of these people could live outside a cage. Tsencho's family assumed that his brother was possessed by deities, and they performed several rituals which didn't help. Tsencho realized that local treatment options were not going to help his brother. So he left Bhutan to undergo medical training and he became exposed to psychiatry via Dr. Murthy from Bangalore. They tried his brother on an antipsychotic medicine, and finally something worked to improve his status. His brother is now able to live with Tsencho's family safely, though certain symptoms remain. He didn't have to spend his life boxed up in the same room. This experience led Tsencho to struggle with the bureaucracy in Bhutan to gain training to become the first Bhutanese psychiatrist and help build up the current mental health system, as under-resourced as it still is. I find stories like this much more compelling than the doctor-bashing and science-denying relativist alternatives. Tsencho's story shows not only that Bhutanese welcome some external influences, they actively strive to bring them to Bhutan to help their loved ones and others with similar problems, realizing that the local culture doesn't have all the answers. In short, I witnessed nothing to indicate that traditional ritual interventions or Sowa Rigpa medicines were effective treatment for these sorts of severe mental disorders. Instead, many patients went through months or years of ritual treatments that were ineffective, and when they were finally brought to the hospital after all else had failed, were either catatonic or had developed a treatment-resistant chronic mental disorder. The situation in Bhutan is marked by a cultural paradigm clash between modern ways of understanding mental illness and traditional spiritual understandings, which often delay or interfere with more effective treatments and more humane ways of ensuring safety. In a public psychiatry context, for severe mental illnesses specifically, I don't see how the local spiritual interpretations of illness are deeply relevant to diagnostic clarity or offer effective treatment for major mental disorders, though taking local understandings into account may certainly be useful in terms of patient engagement. Given my experiment with an interdisciplinary dual identity and the consequent reorientation of my ethics through taking on clinical responsibilities as part of research, How do I understand local ontologies and their relations to bodies? How can I theorize ontology from a more Hallowellian perspective, incorporating the psychological level of analysis and a clinical psychological lens? Obviously, some postulated worldviews and cultural entities are experienced subjectively as realities by most of the people of a society. However, others are not, as was demonstrated by Bhutanese people like Sencha, and by diverse opinions I've found among Navajos in relation to the question of the personhood of peyote, which some people thought was a conscious, omnipresent spirit, while others stated that they understood this personhood simply as a metaphor. An acknowledgement of intracultural variation like this would seemingly be incompatible with the assumption that we've now stepped into a coherent alternative universe, and it suggests we adopt a psychological anthropology of ontology. It's especially unbelievable to me that we can treat collective understandings only as pointing to an alternative universe without appreciating the psychoactivity of cultural meaning. This aspect of meaning was made clear throughout my clinical training and practice. Experiences of training and practice using cognitive psychotherapy, as well as certain psychodynamic frameworks, were striking from an anthropological perspective, in that the target of interventions was the patient's maladaptive interpretive framework, and a change of meanings was associated with a change in mood states and symptoms. This link between narrative structure and psychological states became even more striking during my training and practice in clinical hypnosis while at Harvard Medical School. Cultures, including the domains of cultures we call ontologies, are not simply referential. Cultures are also psychoactive, dynamically shaped in relation to psychological vulnerabilities and needs, and able to alter and manage mood states as well as our general orientation to reality. Cultural meanings may provide affordances for use in ways that are metaphorical, emotionally expressive, subjunctive, functional, symptomatic, didactic, manipulative, or therapeutic. The new ontological anthropology's position that they must be treated only as descriptions of local alternative universes seemingly discounts culture as metaphor, turning the world into hyper-literalist fundamentalists. We humans suffer from mental disorders, but also from fundamental existential narrative ruptures that our ontologies help paper over. I see these most basic cultural interventions as going deep into the essence of being human, arising from the very nature of human subjectivity and existence, and built into the very narrative frameworks of meaning we use to think with. What does stand out as effective spiritual intervention in Bhutan, it seems to me, is the structure of culture, including the role of the concept of karma in the fabric of Bhutanese self-understanding and ontology. I should say here that a prominent theme in my research is therapeutic emplotment, influenced by the work of the anthropologist Cheryl Mattingly. But I use the word emplotment perhaps more in the manner of historian Hayden White to mean an act of placing events or people into a story, a particular plot structure or narrative framing. Therapeutic emplotment is when events are placed into a story that's therapeutic or is intended to be therapeutic. My work extends this concept to a collective level. I've used the term culturally embedded therapeutic emplotment to refer to the situation in which therapeutic narrative structures come to form the very fabric of cultural meaning, so that culture becomes the omnipresent vehicle for therapeutic intervention. This last usage departs from the usage of Mattingly, who characterized therapeutic plots as something improvised and negotiated within the therapeutic dyad. This certainly happens. However, I think it's also crucial to see therapeutic emplotment as a collective social activity as well, and it constitutes my basic approach to understanding the clinical relevance of cultural meaning structures, including ontologies. The structure of culture also emplots in ways that are less improvised in each situation than preordained by tradition. Even dyadic clinical conversations make use of conceptual and narrative materials typical of their culture. The narrative of karma, which is very prevalent in Bhutan, promises a life after this one, even though it may be in a very dissimilar form. Stories help build this up as an experienced reality. For example, Sencho tells a story about his niece, who, while a little girl, would steal other people's alcoholic drinks, drinking them and saying things like, "My wife says I drink too much." And this was interpreted as leftover memories from a previous existence as an adult male drunk, which are the freshest, these memories are the freshest when the child is young. Memories of the previous incarnation. Karma also assures people that the universe is just and that beings will be punished or rewarded in the next life for their actions in this one. Max Weber called karma the most consistent theodicy ever produced by history, referring to a resolution of the basic problem of unequal suffering in the world. One's misfortunes in this life can also be attributed through the law of karma to doings in one's previous existence. For example, if one is blind, this may be attributed to an immoral act in a previous existence that involved one's eyes. Karma is an interesting anthropologically because it sounds like a personalistic etiology, but it acts like a naturalistic one. It seems personalistic because there's an entity responsible for one's condition, your previous incarnation. This might imply that people with certain disabilities or misfortunes might have been seen as deserving them, resulting in stigma. However, I asked many Bhutanese about this, and most people that I've asked about this feel karma doesn't attach blame or stigma to the victim. Saying that a person has a disability because of karma seems to go hand in hand with compassion for that person. This would suggest a naturalistic emphasis on karma as an impersonal force, the law of karma, to which we're all victims, and thus has a sort of exonerating effect on personal responsibility. A Bhutanese friend who's visually impaired told me that seeing his blindness in terms of his own actions in a past life means he doesn't blame his parents for the condition. His blindness was attributed by doctors to a nutritional deficiency, so he could have blamed his parents for not feeding him better. This was a surprising recognition of the social functions of karma narrative by someone inhabiting the narrative. So it seems that this feature of local culture has a therapeutic effect on social relations, functioning as a sort of overarching, omnipresent cognitive intervention, helping to produce a relatively sane and nonviolent society in Bhutan, though certainly not preventing severe forms of mental disorder. Karma as emplotment seems to trigger feelings of compassion and acceptance. It also seems to foster a level of trust in the society. I was once waiting to cross a busy street, and a Bhutanese man walked past me into traffic, which stopped for him, and he said to me, "It's okay, they don't want the bad karma of hitting you." So karma again operates as a sort of morally evaluative panoptical invigilator, though an impersonal one. The deities and spirits provide a more personalistic panoptical gaze. Other therapeutic affordances of Bhutanese culture seem to include the therapeutic expressive aspects of spirit possession that I've discussed, the focus on maintaining tunlam or harmonious relationships with other people as well as spirits dwelling in the land, and the emplotment of death rituals, which emplot loss of a loved one as a gradual process of letting go over 49 days. When I reflect on my experiment with embedded clinical ethnography in Bhutan and in the Navajo Nation, what's most apparent is the multiplicity of the normal and the therapeutic, along with a significant non-relativity of mental illness as a demonstrable etic phenomenon, a set of observable signs and reported symptoms, rather than a set of local cultural interpretations about them. Especially after working in Bhutan, I'm more convinced than ever of the basic similarity of symptom patterns and the de-exoticized common humanity that I share with my patients. Even though local interpretations are variable, local interpretations do not equal observable local symptom patterns. In addition, what some might consider the culturally appropriate treatments that conform to a decolonial ethos can be ineffective and harmful for certain conditions, hindering life chances for individuals who may end up chained or caged for decades. One final takeaway from clinical ethnography: our common humanity. I feel sometimes our common humanity gets lost in all the fashionable fetishizing of cultural difference. This common humanity was illustrated in my research in unexpected cross-cultural parallels, such as the Bhutanese woman possessed by a Shindi, whose experience mirrored Sudanese women possessed by the Tsar spirit. In fact, I later learned that the Bhutanese woman's Shindi possession also occurred as her husband may have been seeking a second wife, which is also a very common pattern in Tsar. I noted other parallels across my two field sites. I told you about my Bhutanese colleague who is visually impaired and who told me that karma meant he didn't blame his parents for the malnutrition that led to his blindness. During my doctoral fieldwork, I invited my Navajo colleague, Hosky, who is also visually impaired, to give a talk with me at the University of Chicago. In the talk, Hosky shared that he received 2 diagnoses for why he lost his vision. He said his Anglo doctor's diagnosis was retinitis pigmentosa, while his Navajo diagnostician told him that while Hosky was in his mother's womb, his father hunted and killed a deer, which created a conflict between giving life and taking life. One of my teachers at the University of Chicago, Richard Schwader, began to interrogate Hosky in a rather rough manner, asking him if, given what he shared, he blamed his father for his blindness. Hosky seemed puzzled and answered that he didn't blame his father, after which Schwader continued to press him, stating that he couldn't see how he did not blame his father. This second cross-cultural parallel, I believe, reveals 2 functioning systems of culturally embedded therapeutic emplotment, sharing a similar, seemingly counterintuitive exoneration of personal blame through attribution to an impersonal cosmic system, and again, suggesting similar human patterns in very distinct societies. I'll conclude by saying that I believe clinically engaged medical anthropology can provide a crucial reality check for much social theory, as well as a crucial balancing of the ethics of intercultural etiquette and acceptance with an ethics focused on actual medical outcomes and life chances, and an ethics that focuses on our common humanity. Thank you again, and I look forward to conversation about it.